All right, let's go ahead and we'll get started. This is John Harold, Lighthouse Lab Services. Appreciate you guys all joining today. We're going to go over direct-to-consumer testing. We'll get into exactly what we're going to cover here in a moment. Some housekeeping items. This is a recorded seminar. If you need a copy of that, we can get it to you afterwards. Just shoot us a message, let us know, and we'll make sure we get you a copy. If you're having any trouble hearing me, feel free to enter that in the chat at any point. Hopefully you can hear me loud and clear at this point. We're not going to get into a lot of legal, so I'm going to throw a legal disclaimer here in a second, just so you guys have a feel for that. But before we got into it, just general housekeeping. Chat function is for, communication. If you have a question, I prefer you to use the Q&A, and so you'll see that on the right side of your screen next to chat. You can answer or ask a question there, and we will get that answered and curate those. We might not be able to get to all questions, but we'll try our best. We're not going to get into nitty-gritty specific details or legal regulatory at a specific level today. We can maybe direct that offline, but we would love to cover the big picture and the landscape of direct-to-consumer testing. There's also going to be some polls, so keep an eye on that. The polls feature is next to Q&A, and we'll have a couple of those that'll happen throughout the presentation. I'll call your attention to that as those come up. So just before we get started, I'm going to just do a plug for our company and what we do. I won't be heavy on this, but I just wanted to make sure you guys are aware of who we are and what we do in case we can assist. So 2 years ago, I merged 3 companies that I had started that were separate entities together. Lighthouse Recruiting is now our recruiting division. Laboratory Startup Consultants is now our consulting division, and LaboratoryBroker.com is now our buyer and seller division. And so, as you can guess from that, we do the recruiting of medical laboratory professionals. We run the largest groups in the world on LinkedIn and Facebook of medical laboratory scientists. We only do medical labs, so we're not a healthcare recruiting company. We just do clinical diagnostic lab, from that phlebotomist lab assistant up to the pathologist level. We do provide the medical laboratory directors, pathologists, and PhDs to 142 CLIA labs around the country. We do more of that than anybody else. Under our consulting division, we also specialize in LDT validation. So we have PhDs that are full-time employees of mine that are available and just specialize in going on site and validating LDTs. We're doing a lot of molecular work right now. We've done a lot of talks over the last few years. Things have pivoted towards CGX, PGX, infectious disease. We do have set pricing for all of those. We also help with validating unique things, direct-to-consumers. An example of that, we've set up a few direct-to-consumer labs recently, and the allergy space has been common. We're looking at some other really neat tests that are being rolled out that we're helping with as well. So that happens under our consulting division. Then our buyer-seller division is just for the purchase and sale of CLIA laboratories. We have about 30 CLIA labs for sale currently. So if you're looking to acquire a CLIA in a certain MAC, you need to acquire in-network contracts, you just want another brick and mortar location, want to expand your test menu, let us know. We have things available and listed. Also, if you're thinking of selling, oftentimes people come to us too late once they've closed the doors. If you are not profitable, you're still sellable. We have groups that are looking for that. So if you're ever looking to make an exit, please let us know. We'd love to help and talk to you about what that looks like. All of our services are merit-based. Our recruiting is strictly contingency. You can review our resumes, interview our candidates for free. You only pay a fee if you decide to hire somebody from us and feel like they're worth it. So anyways, I'll end the pitch there. I would love to meet anyone that's going to be at AACC. I'm going to be there in a few weeks in California and Anaheim. Would love to meet up with you, buy you a cup of coffee, or grab a meal together. So I just put on the screen a way that you can connect. Even if you're not going to AACC, would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. Network with about 21,000 medical lab professionals on there. I think that's the largest network, but love to just hear who's doing what and connect people too. Even if we're not part of it, we'd love to help you connect with others in the industry. So you can use that connect via LinkedIn button to do that if that's something that interests you. All right. This is our legal disclaimer. I'm going to give you guys a moment to read through that. We'll disclaim that we are not a law firm. I'm not an attorney. We're going to go over kind of our experience with direct-to-consumer, and hopefully that's helpful to you. I'm going to give my opinion on kind of what the market looks like. I'm going to try my best to give you some understanding of the regulatory landscape. It is complicated. There's a lot of different entities and authorities in that space, and they don't all necessarily line up. But go ahead and take a moment to look through that disclaimer and just make sure that you're comfortable with that. I do see a question from Elizabeth about getting a copy of this. Yes, we will get a recording to you that includes audio as well as the slide deck if you're interested after the presentation. All right, we're going to move on. What is direct-to-consumer testing? So it seems like it'd be a pretty easy question, but I do want to address it because there is a little bit of nuance to it. Also, we're going to go ahead and throw a poll up right now because I'm curious if any of you have ordered a direct-to-consumer test. So we'll go ahead and we'll publish a poll where you guys can weigh in on that while I answer this question. It goes by a couple different names. So people refer to it as direct-to-consumer testing, direct access testing, or patient-authorized testing. Basically refers to a patient ordering their own laboratory test. And there's a little bit of a difference between that and using a physician, right? So some tests are ordered in certain states in particular with physician involvement. That would not exactly be direct to consumer, but it is kind of a hybrid of direct to consumer and traditional testing where the physician involvement might be through telemedicine, might be minimal. Maybe they're just reviewing the order and approving it, where there's not an official consult. So it's consumer initiated. But that's what we're talking about today is where a patient or a consumer decides that they want a lab test, and maybe that decision is not driven by a physician, even if it is approved by or authorized by them later. And it's a new world and innovative and changing things. And so I think it's important to know about what the opportunity is and what the risk is there as well. Just taking a quick look at the poll, it looks like about 67% of you have never ordered a direct-to-consumer test for personal use. I'd encourage you to do it. It is really interesting, and it gives you a really good understanding. So if this is a space that you're interested in, I think that it is beneficial to go through that process and see how the companies are handling it, what that reporting looks like, because I feel like this is the new frontier of lab testing. But it does look like about a third of you have done that before. I know 23andMe is the most common that we hear about. We'll touch on them, but there's a lot of different direct-to-consumer tests out there. Feel free to enter into the chat function if there are any specific tests you've ordered or had experience with, and if you have any insight based on that. I'm putting up on the screen now some different brands that are in direct-to-consumer, and some of these you might think don't relate because they're outside of the laboratory industry, but on the left side of the screen, you'll see Dollar Shave Club, Casper, which is a mattress company, and Warby Parker, which is a glasses company, represented there. The reason that I'm showing that is I feel like direct-to-consumer is it's a movement beyond lab. Make sure you understand that. It's very disruptive in a positive way if you're on the right side of it, and it's changing the game, right? So Dollar Shave Club, if you're not familiar, is a subscription service for mostly men's razors. They came in and have upset and taken market share from Gillette, which owns 70% of that market. Casper is a leader in the direct-to-consumer mattress space. They've upset there's really big two companies, but four brands you might know: Sealy, Serta, Simmons, and Tempur-Pedic. They own almost 70% of the market there, and it's owned by two companies. So it's a duopoly. And Warby Parker has come into the glasses market, offer those direct to consumer, and cut out the eye care store and eye doctor in many instances. Luxottica, a major player in that industry, owned about 70% of the market. They even own the vision insurance space. Like, they own a lot of that market. So if you think it's bad in the lab with the different payers and how they might be close with LabCorp and Quest, it's even worse in the eye care where they were owned by the same company, literally. So these are good examples, though, because these three groups owned close to 70% market share, so greater than 60% market share, and are being disrupted right now by direct-to-consumer. And we see the same thing in the lab space, and I'm sure you guys could name who those people are. But LabCorp and Quest own about, I believe, 65% of the market in that space. LabCorp is about a $17 billion player, while Quest is about 13.7 billion, and it's a $50 billion market, right? So we've seen some really neat opportunity happen where 23andMe, Color, and Everlywell are big players in this laboratory direct-to-consumer space. Everlywell has a really broad offering. 23andMe is mostly on that genetic side, ancestry and health risk, and Color is a genetic testing group as well. One thing to be aware of as you look at direct-to-consumer, not only is it disruptive in terms of being able to gain new patients and sample type, it also is a different way of business. There's a lot of benefit to that, right? Where there's a brand loyalty that occurs there that you don't see happen in the traditional brick and mortar. Most people are not very loyal to their laboratory brand, don't repeat as customers based on that brand loyalty. You do see that in the direct-to-consumer space. The leader of Everlywell is a woman by the name of Julia Cheek, female entrepreneur, really amazing lady, some cool podcasts out there you can listen to on her. But she came into this space because she said LabCorp and Quest. Can you hear me now? I really apologize. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. That just died on me. I will get back to this real quick and not spend any more time on that. So going over the growth of the market, we have seen it go from about 15 million in 2010 to over 350 million at this point. And that's still really early in the game. You can see that graph shows just exponential growth. And you guys are on the front edge of that if you wanted to get in. I know it seems like 2010 was a long time ago, but we're still 350 million into a $50 billion industry. So I think there's a bunch of room for this to continue to grow. And so we'll go on to kind of just what we're going to cover today: federal and state regulations, telemedicine. We'll get into that, field some questions, collection devices, kitting, the fulfillment, e-commerce, report customization. All of that is unique inside of direct-to-consumer. These are things that occur outside of direct-to-consumer, but they're different. And so we're going to cover some of those differences and nuances as we get into it. As you look to offer direct-to-consumer testing, the first thing that you're going to have to really address is the test clinical or not? If the answer is no, that you do not feel the test is clinical, that's great news. I'm not sure if it's going to be true. We've had a lot of groups think that and then been told otherwise. But if you truly do not have a clinical test, then you do not fall under CMS and CLIA. It also should not fall under FDA for the most part. Maybe there's exceptions to that, but for a test that's not clinical, like say an ancestry test, not going to fall under the CLIA guidelines, and you're able to offer that test pretty much in all 50 states. So I think that's good news. If the test is clinical, you do fall underneath CMS CLIA guidelines. You also are going to fall underneath the state guidelines. So you're going to need to know all of those state regulatory issues. And about half the states do have rules surrounding your ability to offer testing and who that authorized person will be in that state. And that ranges from being the patient up to a full physician. And there's a few states that have things in between. So that's one of the first questions and key questions you have to answer. Another is it test FDA approved, right? And so there's a few different parts of this FDA component where you don't want to mix up whether the collection kit could be FDA approved, right? That doesn't necessarily mean everything else is. If it's an LDT, there are some people that firmly believe you cannot offer an LDT as a direct-to-consumer test. There's others that are doing that, and it's being done on a wide scale. The FDA does not oversee LDTs at this point, but they do oversee, through Federal Trade Commission, I guess, the marketing of medical information. And so it might be that the test is not what falls under them, but the way that you market that test. So there is certainly some complicated landscape there and things that you'll want to maybe get official legal opinion on and dig deeper on before you really roll out in full scale. I also wanted to throw up this CLIA CMS definition of a lab. It's very sweeping and broad and hard to fall outside of that. And I highlighted in orange the part that I feel like is the catch-all that most groups fall into. So measure or otherwise describe the presence or absence of a various substance or organism in a human body. That definitely lends itself to pretty much all lab testing. And so it's hard to fall outside of that. But that defines you as a lab. That doesn't necessarily mean that you fall under FDA guidelines, but it would mean that as a clinical diagnostic laboratory test would need to meet CLIA standards. You guys able to hear me all right? No, I'm seeing Saad, you're saying no. Okay, good. Moving on to compliance, where can you distribute the test? We do have a survey that we've done that we share with customers and clients that goes over all 50 states and really gets into that on a deeper level. Also, how do we get involved with telemed? So that's the secret, right? So direct access testing states, about half those states, you don't need to have physician involvement. You might still want to from a risk perspective. How do you involve telemed? It's very simple in terms of theory, but how do you compliantly do it? You need to have a physician that approves a lab test. So that might mean with no physician or no involvement between the physician and the patient. Might simply be an intake form that's collected from the patient that the physician reviews and approves. If a patient wants to order, say, an STD test or something like that and believes they've been exposed to it, it's probably going to be close to 100% of the time that a physician would approve that, and they don't necessarily need to have a conversation with the patient in order to authorize that test. LabCorp Quest, the way they're doing it, they say on their site that they use an independent group of physicians to do that and want that arm's length distance from there. What gets complicated is how do you pay that physician? That's the part that I think is the trickiest. So you have labs that are doing this. Ways that they get around it include paying an hourly rate to the physician, whether they order tests or not, a per patient transaction, whether they order a test or not. But I do think that if you were to look at that in the brick and mortar space and say, we're going to pay a physician to write lab orders, that seems non-compliant, seems like a breach of anti-kickback. And so not a big fan of that. I think there are more compliant ways to do it, which includes charging the patient for that physician involvement and then having those funds go directly from the patient to the physician without commingling those funds. Because I think if the funds are collected by the laboratory and then distributed to the physician, it's kind of like being a little bit pregnant, where it was money line directly from the laboratory to the physician for ordering a lab test. And even if that was just for a moment that it touched your account, I think that that's going to potentially be seen as not compliant, and you want to be careful of that. There's at least risk there to be aware of, although it is being done at large scale right now. Just throwing up there, this is a screenshot that talks about our 50-state comparison study. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. If you guys are interested in that, that's certainly something we can make available. Lots of money spent on legal, as well as research done with some of the authorities in the industry on which states allow what, and referencing the different state laws for each of those. Basically, if in case you're not aware at this point of how it works, the test is being marketed directly to a consumer. That could be done through pay-per-click ads on Facebook or Google AdWords. It could be done through print campaign. It could be done through television. But you're driving people to a website, typically might be through an app, that then order a test. A collection kit is then sent out to them. That collection kit, we'll get into a little bit more what that needs to include and how that might differ from collection kits that are typically used or sent to physician offices. And then resulting normally occurs back through either the website or the app back to the consumer. So the collection type, and I think we get into that in kitting here, best if it's a simple collection that can be done by the consumer in their home. So if you think of a spit vial, you think of maybe a hair clipping, a cheek swab, those are things that you feel pretty confident that with some instruction that a patient should be able to collect at their home. When you get into blood, it gets a little trickier. There are ways to do it, and there are people doing it. We've validated some dried blood spot collection devices. I think I've pricked my fingers with every one that's out there and looked at results that come from that. And so that's one way to do it. You do have to make sure that you are validated to perform those tests, those blood tests on dried blood spot with microfluidics. It's much less sample size to work with. So it takes a little bit of work. Most of the groups we've talked to that have validated that have seen it take, greater than a year, maybe 18 months in order to get that validated. That said, we have also seen a ton of VC money and investor interest in labs that have validated tests for dried blood spot and other microfluidics. And so I do think it's a valuable thing to pursue. I think it is next generational, and that's kind of where the future is going. And so if you don't have that ability now, it might be something worth pursuing, or just thinking creatively of how you might be able to validate for other sample types that are a little bit easier to collect, like cheek swab. The kit itself also, you want to think of this differently than you would the kits that you're sending 50 at a time to a physician's office. This needs to be a consumer product, so you almost need to think more like a iPhone box, right? The experience of that that patient receiving that kit, opening it up, the branding that's possible on that. You also need to include in there some way for them to quickly and easily get that sample back to you, right? So if you can send out a box that's also able to be returned, that's a very efficient way to do it. You also need to make sure that the instructions on there are written at a level that a patient can understand. They typically guide you to use maybe a 3rd grade level as being the rule of thumb for how you write instructions. QR codes that maybe link back to YouTube videos are pretty common and might be a good idea. A lot of pictures, infographics, things that make it easy for a patient to understand, and then understand that they're still going to probably mess it up more than your average healthcare worker would on collecting a sample. All right, moving on, the actual operational component of that. So as you take in an order, that means that your website or app needs to be able to receive an order. It needs to be HIPAA compliant. There is a lot of rules around this HIPAA side of this, and how long you maintain that patient data needs to be available to the patient if they request it even later. It needs to be collected in a fashion that does not in any way expose it to anybody else that shouldn't see it. As you take in the order, you also have a much more robust fulfillment and operational component to your business now, because you're shipping these kits and receiving them one by one, right? Where you might have 50 clinics that you support in order to do 2,000 or 3,000 samples, you're going to now have 2,000 different interactions with individuals where you're mailing out a kit and getting it back. So you need to think about that and make sure that you're prepared to receive samples on that scale, and that you're able to rapidly send those kits out. And so there are some vendors that specialize in that. We have some guidance and opinion on who's doing that well, and would be happy to speak with you about that if that was something you want to engage us to talk about further. You also may want to consider making sure that as they order that test, each kit is customized. So it has that return label, has that identifier on it already printed out, and make it as simple as possible for them to collect it and return it without any type of confusion. The report itself also really important on how you report that and who you report it to. There might be certain states where that report needs to go through a physician. There's certain states where it does not. Even in states where physician involvement is not required, for certain types of test results, critical results, you may want to report through a physician no matter what. And that could be a telemedicine physician or through their primary care physician. You would just need to incorporate that up front so that you know how to result that. But things you need to think about, and the Guardian, for what it's worth, I'm not sure how valid of a source it was, but reported, I think 2 to 3 days ago, that in the UK, they're seeing a lot of false positives from direct-to-consumer testing, and there's like a movement of physicians and lobbying and advocating for more regulation to be put on that, because people are getting bad results and then taking action on their own, right? And so you have to think, worst case scenario, you give someone a result that says they have an STD, cancer, something along those lines, and they decide to jump out their office window. Do they decide to go maybe get a mastectomy? Hopefully the physician on the other side of that would prevent that from happening. But there's people taking action, people stopping their medication based on results, right? So you might say that they don't have a condition that they've been diagnosed with, and so they might decide to stop taking medication. So there's risk there, and you want to be careful how you go about delivering those results. Also, if you're delivering it directly to the consumer, you need to make sure that they can interpret that easy. If you're delivering a numerical value, you need to include reference ranges. And for the most part, you want to stay away from giving a diagnosis, right? And not even for the most part, just in general. Do not diagnose. That's not your role as a laboratory. Your role is to deliver data. And so make sure that you don't be too specific. You want to be careful on even the material that you provide along with that you let them draw their own conclusions, or the physician to do that. All right. Payment. So this is something that'll be good and bad, where it's mostly cash pay, right? So I know most lab owners that deal with commercial payers or Medicare, Medicaid. That's probably sounds really good to know that you're going to be paid cash at the beginning, and that payment is guaranteed. So you're not having to file claims and chase down providers in order to get paid. So that's the good news. The other side of that, though, is how do you compliantly receive that? How do you charge their credit card and receive payment for maybe a physician consult, a laboratory test, and get those funds to the correct people in a way that's compliant? In my opinion, most of the ones that I've seen out there are not compliant. They might have an itemized shopping cart that shows the fees for physician consult as well as for the laboratory test, but that's happening in one transaction where they're running the card once. Those funds are commingled, they're coming into a bank account and then dispersed. And so I do think that you want to stay away from that. Price sensitivity, another thing to be aware of. If you're getting paid, $4,000 or greater for a cancer genetic test now by Medicare, you might not find that that's what patients are willing to pay out of pocket. And so you need to make sure that the price that you're paying is appetizing and appealing to a consumer. And then if you are offering that test to individuals that are ordering it through traditional brick and mortar, and maybe you're billing insurance or Medicare, you need to be really careful with your fair market value and how you're charging that, right? Because if there's a disparity of pricing for what you're offering consumers versus what you're offering or charging to Medicare, that could be seen as a markup, and it could be an issue. So that's pricing and payment. Let's see. Click through a few slides here. All right, so reporting, I think we covered that enough. I'm gonna go ahead and skip that. Examples of direct-to-consumer tests that are most commonly offered, let's hit on that. Sexually transmitted disease is really common. A couple reasons for that, and so I'm gonna use this as an example just for you to think about the market and be creative. But individuals typically don't like to have an interaction with the physician when they're dealing with something that like a sexually transmitted disease that there might be a little bit of privacy concern regarding. Also, we're seeing direct-to-consumer companies be very successful on college campuses. And so if you dig down on that, college students are typically on their parents' insurance, right? And they don't necessarily want mom and dad getting an explanation of benefits that shows that Johnny's got gonorrhea. And so they will pay out of pocket to have not only the anonymity of being able to order through an app and result through an app, but also to not have that billed to insurance and potentially have their parents aware of that. So that's a good example. Another area that we see a lot of activity for direct-to-consumer tends to be around health, wellness, or almost like those vanity type tests. We've seen testing for how do you test your skin to see which makeup products are best, right? I wouldn't have thought that that would have worked, but people want to know and are willing to pay cash for that. Hormone testing, testosterone testing seems to be pretty common. Food allergy screening, we built a food allergy lab recently, and we've seen that there's been a lot of interest by individuals to know how they can change their diet, right, based on what foods they're able to digest or that their body responds to best. There's maybe some unsettled science there too, so you want to just make sure that you're comfortable with any test that you're offering. It's definitely a gray area where we don't see who has the burden of proof for showing the clinical utility of this test. Once you take insurance out of it, that's been sort of the gatekeeper on whether a test is needed. And if a patient is willing to pay cash and order a test, what is the physician's role in determining whether a patient should be able to order a test or not. If a person wants to order a food allergy test, should they be able to do that? Do you need to, as the physician, have confidence that those results really are applicable? What if a guy wants to order a pregnancy test? Right? If he's willing to pay cash for it, who knows, right? So there's some questions that probably need to be answered, but in general, I think if people are paying cash and you take away the medical necessity requirements by the payers that are paying for that test, it really opens things up. Launching direct to consumer, these are some of the next steps and some of the guidance that we would provide to you guys. And so we'll go ahead and we'll allow you to respond to that. But we do have a package that consists of 10 consulting hours, as well as that 50 state survey that we've done. Done some legal on that, as well as gotten advice from CAP, from ASCP, from some of the genetic boards on what their view is on all 50 states and where you can order tests and where you cannot. So you'll see on the bottom of your screen there, if you want more information, you'd like to potentially explore that, we're offering a special today where we're going to do that for $1,900. So for that $1,900, you do get that 50 state survey as well as 10 hours of consulting. And those consulting hours can be used with our PhDs, CAP inspectors that are on staff with us. You could be used with myself if you're more interested in the business and marketing side of that. And so we'll talk through what that looks like. We'll connect you with vendors that we feel do the best job of supporting direct-to-consumer or knowledgeable about it, whether it's fulfillment of ordering, the kitting, the software required to receive and result out orders. So we'll give you everything we've learned, and you'll be able to pick our brain on that. But that's the basics of it. I'll try to see if there's a couple questions that maybe we can go through and answer here. So it looks like Cliff is asking, heard anything about requiring genetic counseling for positive test results on direct-to-consumer? Yeah, I believe that is state by state level, but also best practice too. And so I think in certain states, California being one of them, you do need to include a genetic counselor when you're providing genetic results. And so we do offer that too. We have a team of remote genetic counselors. We offer that to some of the laboratories that we support, where they can be available on a case-by-case basis. We also do offer physicians in all 50 states that are available to order tests or help with the resulting of those tests. So if that's something you're interested in, we'd love to talk to you about it, as we can support you with our network of physicians. But sometimes that comes down to being a judgment call too, on if you're delivering a genetic result that you feel is going to be difficult for a consumer to interpret accurately. You might want to offer that genetic counseling services. Sometimes it's an add-on. We've seen several groups do that, where it's up to the consumer to decide if they want to pay that fee to speak with a genetic counselor. But you as the lab at least made it available to them. That gives you a little bit of coverage too from a liability standpoint. How long does it take, Glenn's asking, to go from start to launch on direct-to-consumer? Rough guess. If you have a validated test ready to offer, we can be pretty quick on that. And so it's more on game planning on how we want to roll that out. We might want to roll that out in phases, where we start with offering to the states. About half the states offer direct access testing. And so assuming it's a test that we feel is not high risk, I would say we would offer it to those states first, and we could roll that out pretty rapidly. And then we might want to connect telemed on the back end for those states that do require physician authorization of the test and maybe need a physician consult on the results side. But I think you can probably get that rolled out in about 60 days. It also depends on your infrastructure and ability to receive those tests on your website. We do have a group that specializes in building out the kind of e-commerce shopping cart side of a lab's website so that they can receive those orders. And so we can connect you with them. But there is a little bit of time. Mostly it's on coming up with that game plan and putting in the phases on how to go about rolling it out. So hopefully that answers your question, Glenn. The list of states that allow hormone testing and wellness testing without a physician involvement, that would be included in our 50-state survey. And so we're happy to get that to you. You can respond via that push that was on the screen. If you didn't respond via that, Dr. Kapoor, let us know or connect with me, and I'll make sure that I get you that. But we'd be happy to provide you with that 50-state survey. Other questions? So it's cash pay on credit card. Are you saying there needs to be 2 credit card charges, one for the test and one for the MD consult? So the way that we've structured it, you could do it through 2 charges, Glenn, and that would be more compliant, where you're able to keep the funds separate. we do have a solution that allows it to be done in one interaction. So from the consumer standpoint, it looks like their card was swiped once. They do see a shopping cart of itemized list, so they know that there's separate charges. But in reality, those funds go directly, it's broken up into, the laboratory's fee, the physician's fee, the consult fee, and those funds go directly to those accounts and individuals without being commingled. And I recommend that. I think that's the most compliant solution. I think we're the only ones I know that are doing that. There might be others, but every other group I've talked to is not doing that. And I do think that that's going to open them up to some liability down the road as this draws more and more scrutiny as the market grows. Got some questions on whether a recording will be available. Yes, it will. Anybody else? Any other questions? So not necessarily a platform, Megan. We've just worked directly with a bank and with an e-commerce company to develop the fee splitting, and probably not the right term, especially in this industry, but the ability to collect those funds in separate transactions and get them to the accounts that are appropriate without commingling those. So we'd be happy to talk to you more about if that's something you want us to help you with. Can a patient use the reports generated by a direct-to-consumer order in a legal case? I'm going to disclaim that I don't officially know the answer on that. I don't know if that's ever come up. I know paternity testing is a big part of that. I believe that there's no reason that they shouldn't, unless there's a state rule that prevents it. But the laboratory result will be delivered by a CLIA accredited laboratory, and so I would imagine that should be admissible in court. Might need to be interpreted by an expert witness, but that's surely my opinion. That's off the hip. Well, it looks like that's all the questions that you guys had in there. Hopefully this was helpful. Please let us know if you'd like more information on that. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my email address here in the chat box. So if you wanted to follow up with me and get more information, you'll be able to do that. You'll have it. Let us know also if we can help you with anything else. Talked about our services at the beginning. So if we're able to help you with staffing your lab, we're doing more of that than anybody that I know of in the medical lab industry specifically. Doing a lot of molecular work there. If you need ASCB certified molecular scientists, we can help. Looking at our resumes, interviewing our candidates does not cost anything, so you can compare them against other candidates you're doing on your own. If you want to get testing up and running within your laboratory, we'd love to help. We'd love to talk to you about validating tests, whether it's for direct to consumer or if you just want to start offering wound, infectious disease, RPP, CGX, PGX. That's what we're doing the most of right now. We can get in there and get that set up pretty quickly. Like I mentioned earlier, we can also help with purchasing a CLIA laboratory or selling your lab if you guys wanted to make an exit. So hopefully this was helpful. I'll hang out for a minute or two in case anybody else has any more questions, but that's all I have. Thank you all.